Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, February 19th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get started, John, with your understanding, your take of what has happened in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia.
Right. Well, the Russian perception is that the American side is a kasha, is a porridge, is a mess. But it's necessary not to be impolite to say so. And the question to be answered is by what standard can we measure from a Russian point of view what the US side showed, what they did, and therefore what will happen next. So let me try to answer your question by turning it around a little bit. Um, First, what should the Russian side do next in relation to what they saw, what they tested? It's very clear that, and Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister, made it very clear from the beginning before he arrived that it was a US initiative to hold the meeting, that it had value to the Russian side to hear and to test what the American side came with. Okay? Now, the first thing that the Russian side should be doing is to reassure its own allies that it's not betraying them for a private deal with the United States. That's a concern, especially after Syria, after the loss of Bashar al Assad. And in fact, that's going to happen. Foreign Minister Lavrov will be going down to Johannesburg in a day. We'll be spending 2 days with the G20. He will be in a position to talk directly to China and to other allies. I don't know, but I would assume that Russia will send somebody significant, perhaps Mr. Patrushev, to Iran, and somebody equally significant, perhaps Mr. Shoigu, perhaps someone else, to North Korea to indicate, to explain what happened, how they perceive it, what they should do, and ask their opinion. In other words, build an alliance. That's what a strong power does after a session like this. And after all, the Americans said they were doing that themselves. Secretary of State Rubio said he had telephoned France, Germany, Italy, and then the UK. Note that he put the UK fourth, and then the foreign minister of the EU. So first reassure your allies that you haven't betrayed, that you have, this is what happened. Second, if you're facing a test of, then you want to understand what the Americans are going to do next. And the Russian side has been preparing for this for quite a while, since the end of the Biden administration, since the election of President Trump. The very clear indication on the battlefield is that President Putin has ordered a significant reduction of operations. You can see it in the daily Ministry of Defense briefing. At the moment, and for this week, what the Defense Ministry bulletin says is that the casualty rate inflicted on the Ukrainians has fallen to about 900 to 950 men killed a day. Whether that's true or not, whether it's exact or not, the point is that this is half of the killed in action, KIA, casualty rate that the ministry was announcing 2 or 3 months ago. In other words, operations along the line have been reduced. Second, Mr. Lavrov said it in his press conference after Riyadh, that Russia had reduced its electric war campaign, its targeting of electricity production plants and electricity grid, so that it was only east of the Dnieper River, along the line of contact, was the electric war campaign, which had for more than 2 years aimed at cutting off electricity throughout the country has now been reduced to the area of combat. And Mr. Lavrov said the reason is that the electric war campaign is limited to targets that serve the combat. These are two very important concessions that President Putin ordered. Now, if you're testing the other side and they don't reciprocate, you need to pull a surprise. You need to show that Russia has not unilaterally reduced its military capacity, its readiness to fight, and its military goals. It could, for example, Russia could say to the United States, reciprocate, please. Why are you still running drones across the Black Sea that help the Ukrainians target Crimea, the hinterland of Russia, and so forth? The US has not reciprocated with any form of military reduction that I'm aware of. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't believe they have. So if the military balance is in terms of negotiating symbols, it's completely unbalanced, and Russia has accepted to make concessions that have had no reciprocation from the United States. On the other hand, I think that the Russian view is that Mr. Hegseth and the Pentagon don't know what to do next. They don't know. They haven't reached a decision. Mr. Hegseth contradicted himself in Poland last week by saying, first, the US will withdraw troops, and second, he'd like to see more troops in Poland. Which is it? Mr. Trump said in Florida on the specific question of US troops that the issue hasn't come up. That's untrue. It may not have come up in his mind, but he said it hasn't come up. And in any event, he doesn't want to see US troops pulled out of Europe. That's not been reported, but he said so. Yes, during the Riyadh affair, during the Riyadh conference, it was clear that the Ukrainians had attacked Kropotkinskaya pumping station. That's a Russian-based target in Krasnodar region, which pumps oil that comes from Kazakhstan, partly owned by the Caspian Pipeline Consortium of Kazakhstan and the United States. It's a Kazakh-US operation. They attacked that and damaged it severely or significantly. It'll take a couple of months to repair. And in the meantime, Kazakh oil will not be pumped to the volume that it was. Was that an attempt by the Ukrainians without US knowledge? Or was it an attempt to push again on Russia's readiness to impose to have a tit for tat? In the past, President Putin and the general staff have always said, we'll have tit for tat. You do that to us, we will do something to you. Mr. Lavrov said that the Americans at the table indicated they wanted a moratorium on energy attacks. Russia would stop their electric war campaign, in return for which the Ukrainians would stop hitting Russian oil refineries and the Kropotkinskaya kind of attack. Mr. Lavrov didn't say there was any agreement on that, but if one's testing whether Trump, Rubio, Waltz are genuine or whether they're grandstanding and faking, one of the things that Russia ought to be doing is surprising the other side and testing the other side. And a test on the Black Sea, a test on the battlefield would be appropriate. Now, that's the military side. The political side would be to see if the opposite numbers, Rubio at the State Department, Hegseth at the Pentagon, and coordinated by Waltz at the National Security Council, have a political framework in mind. There's lots of speculation You do it, your guests do it. There's plenty of paper flying around. There was a meeting in Paris to discuss, and so on and so on and so on. But from a Russian point of view, if the Americans are perceived to be unready except to grandstand, except to have PR, except to have high publicity summit meeting without a real agenda, what political tests can Russia create for them? And did they do that in Riyadh? Well, the answer is they didn't on military, but they did on political. But on political, all that was achieved, it's significant, but it's limited, was the agreement to return ambassadors to the capitals, to end this process of harassment by the United States of Russian diplomatic operations throughout the United States, the seizure of property and so forth and so on. In other words, Mr. Lavrov correctly tested the other side's readiness to re-establish normal diplomatic procedure. That's not a military test. It's not really a political test. So what would be a political test? The Russian Foreign Ministry submitted a treaty with terms back in December 2021. When the US rejected it, as the Blinken-Nuland-Biden gang did, we were on the road to war, and the war occurred. Let's leave out what Mr. Trump describes as the road to war that wouldn't have happened if he'd been in charge. Okay, let's leave that out. What would be a test of US willingness at this point to act genuinely instead of Trump's, let's call it, grandstanding? Well, that treaty proposed a NATO rollback and suggested the date of the rollback should be to 1997. But that would leave Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, not to mention Finland and the Baltic states, out of NATO. Well, let's forget this wishful thinking that the NATO alliance is collapsing. Let's test, if you're Russian, whether the United States, in Rubio's department, in Hegseth's department, the Pentagon, and in Walz's capacity as the coordinator at the National Security Council, do they have a concept of NATO rollback? If they don't, how about a few signals of what would be reduced threat to Russia? Would they like to shutter, close down, suspend funding for the nuclear capable bases that threaten Russia in Poland and in Romania? Would they like to suggest that the Aegis bases, those are the two bases, would be withdrawn because they are major nuclear threats? What about the possibility of withdrawing US forward deployed nuclear missile warheads in Germany and nuclear bombs in Germany, England, Rota, Spain, Suda Bay in Greece, and so forth and so on? Is there a Pentagon readiness to have a program of reduction of tension along the lines that would meet Russia's concerns for the deepening war between the United States and Russia? If that's the test, and it wasn't discussed, let's see if that, by that standard, Rubio is capable, Hegseth is capable of coming back through these working groups that have been proposed and are to work, and come back with a set of mutual, let's call them confidence building measures, because Russia's been building confidence. Putin offered and has implemented confidence building limits on the war in the Ukraine. So what I'm trying to suggest as a way of answering your question, Nima, and it's a good question, but I'm trying to answer it in a different way. Let's not speculate about what we couldn't hear. Let's see if by the standard of what Russia needs for security, the US side came to the table prepared. And my understanding is the US side did not come prepared. It was a kasha, a mess. They have not assembled in State Department terms, in Pentagon terms, or at the National Security Council, the capacity to know what they want to do. Hence, you get all this plethora of contradictory statements, which go right to the top, where President Trump doesn't seem to know what exactly happened. He was briefed, but his memory isn't too hot. Second, President Trump can only speak in slogans. He can't speak in more than sloganeering, which is what the Mar-a-Lago press conference shows. By his standard, by what Rubio had to say, by what Waltz had to say, as compared to the Russians, the US was unprepared. So who was prepared at Riyadh? That's a very interesting question. And the answer is Mr. Dmitriev. Kirill Dmitriev, the head of, chief executive of the Russia Direct Investment Fund, a kind of state wealth fund, US educated, speaks fluent English, and thinks he understands how US politics works. He had, and I show you, a paper. He did more talking at Riyadh than either the head of delegation, Mr. Lavrov, or Yuri Ushakov, who represented President Putin, who's his foreign policy advisor. What Mr. Dmitriev did was to flash for US press, for Russian press, a paper on how much US corporations had lost because they pulled out. He was dangling a lure, a financial lure for the US to make a business deal that would cement the, new goodwill, the new possibility of peace, and so forth and so on. Now, Mr. Dmitriev is bound to be a better expert at accounting than I am. But he has a very primitive notion of how commerce works as a lobbying force in the United States and in Washington. The idea that oil companies influence presidents was a common view that the Arabs had since the 1940s. They thought oil company interests in the Middle East, in the Arab world, will combat the rise of Israel and Zionism and US support for the Israeli state. That is a fundamental mistake, and we know it. Mr. Dmitriev's repeating it. It's a very primitive idea of money makes power in Washington. But President Trump has encouraged that view, and there is a whole, let's call it, lobby in Washington, in Moscow today, saying this was a great advance. There were consummate political skills displayed by Trump, Rubio, Waltz, and so forth in the session. In fact, what there was a very limited degree of testing of the other side by the expert at testing. Mr. Lavrov did a very clever performance to the extent that he could. But if you look at his face, he was very grim-faced as he briefed. I've not seen him as grim-faced since December 6 and 7, when he had to go to the press and explain why Russia wasn't defending the Syrian regime against the Turkish-led attack. I understand from my sources and from what I can see and from what the script is that the Russian leadership thinks that the US is vulnerable, the US is in a mess, it is undecided, and it's unclear what particular policies, concessions, terms will emerge. So they've agreed to talk, and that's very valuable considering that the Biden administration refused to talk. But whether the outcome will be any different is a completely different story. And nobody in Moscow is very confident that they can predict what the Americans will do. Hence, I put it to you, the way to answer is the Russian side going to do next the kinds of military test, political test, and business test? Business test meaning the sanctions, lifting the sanctions, SWIFT as a payment system, oil and gas to flow, and so forth. Are these tests going to produce evidence that the Americans know what they're doing or are still committed to war?
Here is, John, here is what Michael McFaul tweeted on X. He said Trump's team allegedly has offered Putin Ukrainian territory, no NATO membership for Ukraine, no US soldiers in Ukraine, the withdrawal of the of US soldiers from Europe, including from frontline states. He's talking about Romania and all those states, and sanction relief. Putin's return offer nothing. Is he really reported on what has happened in Riyadh, or
Well,
he's just exaggerating just to put pressure on Trump?
Michael McFaul has had a career of exaggerating, and a very well-paid career, and a very rewarded career for exaggerating the Russian enemy and exaggerating his own competence to handle it. I've read what McFaul has said, and I take it that, remember, he said the adverb allegedly. So he's trying to mobilize what he believes to be an unbalanced pro-Putin position of the Trump administration as a comparison and a contrast with his own faithful commitment to fighting the evil Russian empire, the Putin totalitarians, all these themes that McFaul has pursued all his life, all his academic career. So I take what he says as typical of Michael McFaul, as accurate as Michael McFaul has been all his career, and as an indication, basically, that he's out of power, out of influence, and unable to argue from any evidence, because he doesn't know what surfaced in the meeting. And I believe the Russian side has a better grip of what happened. And I think the text of what Mr. Rubio, Mr. Waltz, and Mr. Trump all said indicates much more clearly that McFaul is lying for purpose, that the US side is not committed to anything because they are contradicting one another. And if you contradict one another, it means bureaucratically in a government that you haven't sorted out your lines of command. You haven't sorted out the way papers flow in and out of the National Security Council for coordination. How could it? Waltz has fired most of the middle and lower level staff in the National Security Council on loyalty grounds. That means he can't coordinate. So Waltz was there to echo what Rubio had to say. And Rubio looked as nervous and inexperienced as I've ever seen a Secretary of State in such a meeting. So answer quickly, McFaul is exaggerating and lying for political purpose, but the purpose is irrelevant now. Irrelevant to the Russian side and irrelevant to the Trump side. He's sitting in California and it's hot air.
The other thing you've mentioned about Kazakhstan and the pipeline, in which is, as you've mentioned, belongs to Kazakhstan together with the United States.
Yes.
What would that bring to Russia? What sort of pressure would that bring to Russia if the main goal was Russia?
The Caspian Pipeline Consortium is long established. It runs a pipeline of oil from Kazakhstan across to essentially to allow Novorossiysk tankers porting in Novorossiysk to carry the oil out down the Black Sea through the Turkish Straits and to market. Frankly, an attack like this hurts Kazakhstan. It has minimal damage for Russia. And President Putin has rung to telephone to indicate that Russia will help repair it as quickly as possible in a good neighborly sense. As an attack, it's like all the other refinery attacks. These are pinpricks which in accumulation damage the flow of oil, that damage the petroleum supply to a small extent, but have no real strategic value. They don't affect the price of gasoline at the petrol pump for Russian drivers. They don't affect the supply of oil and gas or energy as Russia needs to move it despite the sanctions. These are pinpricks which are intended by the Ukraine and amplified by the pro-Ukrainian press everywhere to mean that Ukraine is still fighting and is still capable of, quotes, winning. Pinpricks are not winning a war. On the other hand, there is a serious Russian argument, but not allowed by meaning noise. It's not vocalized publicly, that ask questions like, why is Pokrovsk not Russian yet? For 6 months, the advance has been slow along the line, but Pokrovsk was to have been Russianized and recaptured and re-civilized months ago. It's still about 6 kilometers away from the advanced lines of Russian forces. Why is there any significant Ukrainian resistance, as there is in Kursk? And why are they continually able to be resupplied? These are sorts of tactical, locational questions, but they are asked and debated quietly in Moscow, as with a concern that the military, not to discredit the Russian army, but to raise the question, what are the political constraints on Russian tactics and strategy at this point? That's an important debate at the leadership level. It's an important debate among experts, think tanks, and public opinion. But in that large debate, the Kropotkinskaya attack is insignificant.
Before these sort of talks starting between the United States and Russia, Donald Trump was talking, as you remember, he introduced Keith Kellogg as his envoy for solving the situation in Ukraine. In Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, we haven't heard about Keith Kellogg. He wasn't one of the people, one of the officials in Riyadh to negotiate with Russians. Right after these negotiations, again, they're talking about Keith Kellogg being in charge of negotiations with Russians. What is the issue with Keith Kellogg? Every time they're talking about he's coming, he's not going to be part of the team, and right now again he's going to be in charge of what's going on in Ukraine.
In our last podcast, Nima, you will know that you asked me about General Kellogg, and I said he's had a military career of losing, and he's a moron. He cannot address conceptually for more than a few minutes. His performance in Munich in the panel with Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, made Sikorski look reasonable, rational, and intellectual. And you've had since then Colonel Wilkerson, who was on your podcast very creatively a day or so ago. And He didn't call Kellogg a moron. He called his position absurd. We both agree. Kellogg had a role in the Trump election campaign. He and Fred Fleets produced a paper at the think tank that supplied the Trump campaign with slogans that Trump could get in his head. And that was the first published, let's call it, Trump plan for the Ukraine war, I think April of 2024. I believe it was Fleets who did most of the thinking and most of the writing, but Kellogg's the general, and Fleets was a National Security Council staff man, if I'm not mistaken. And Kellogg has achieved a higher level of reputation for brains from that paper and from Trump's sloganeering out of that paper. That's the background. And out of an election campaign, a lot of people come with dibs on jobs, with the right to get rewarded. And it's been useful for Trump to put somebody up quickly as his emissary for negotiating with the Ukrainians and with the Russians. Of course, he hasn't negotiated with anyone yet. He does a lot of talking elsewhere, and that talking is self-contradictory. It's simple without being consistent with anything else that anyone else is saying. Now, the problem, if you're from a Washington point of view, as I remember it, is that he's an outlier. He's not connected to any bureaucracy. He's not subordinate to the State Department. He's not part of the Pentagon. He's a general, but not part of the Pentagon. He doesn't have a relationship with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So who's his staff? Who's he reporting to? He can't report directly to the president. He'd have to report directly to Michael Waltz at the National Security Council, but that's not happening. He doesn't have intelligence access either. So he's a floating individual talking his book, wants to stay there, wants to get the publicity, wants to earn a retirement increment on whatever money he was earning as a consultant before. Instead, he's proving he's a fool. And he's offending the line in the Pentagon, at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and offending the diplomats at the State Department, and offending the CIA, Mr. Ratcliffe's new shop. And this is another example of kasha, of porridge, of mess. And that makes a unique opportunity for the Russian side. You eat porridge. You take the vulnerability and indecisiveness and contradictoriness of the US side, and you exploit it by testing it first and pulling surprises. Pulling surprise to catch the US at this point is good tactics. Instead, what Mr. Lavrov has implied is that the Russian strategy and tactic is protraction, delay. Keep talking, let them make more of a mess of themselves. I don't disagree that protraction as a strategy right now is a good one for the Russian side. I also believe that militarily speaking, surprise is also good, and they can be operated in parallel. Keep talking, but pull surprises and see what the Americans do. In this game, Kellogg is a zero.
If that's the case, why don't you think that the team, these people who went to Saudi Arabia, were totally clueless about the conflict and the way to negotiate with the Russians. That's why they're getting back to Keith Kellogg.
That's a good point, Nima. If it seemed to you, and it seems to me, and it seems to the Russian sources I deal with, that Rubio and Waltz and Witkoff were clueless in the sense that they didn't come with an agenda. They didn't know what they wanted to achieve. Instead, it's very clear that Sergei Lavrov, who's very good at this, tested them. Mr. Dmitriev, however, was not at the main negotiations. Business was kept out of the principal negotiating that was done between Rubio, Waltz on one side, and Ushakov and Lavrov on the other. We see from the pictures, and I've written this up, so if audience would like to look a bit more, I've written it up in today's Dance with Bears. Dmitriev was ranking third in protocol when the shaking hands took place in the anteroom, but once Lavrov and Ushakov went into the main negotiating hall, Dmitriev disappeared. Lavrov downplayed Dmitriev's role and said he made a presentation. The presentation probably occurred at lunch. They broke for lunch. So we don't know what happened on the US side. There's been the American press are more incompetent than the Russian press in exploring what their own delegation was doing. Troyanovsky, the New York Times reporter, was too busy pumping his pieces full of Ukrainian propaganda and attacks on Trump from a New York Times, New York State point of view. The US correspondents seemed clueless, to use your word, Nima, as to how the US delegation was working. Clueless. And that's funny because the Russians did a far better job of monitoring their own people and asking more intelligent questions of their minister, of Lavrov, than the CNN and AP man, Matt Lee, asked of in the US press conference. And notably, they had to do it separately because the US side was frightened of having to have a press conference with Lavrov at the same time. They didn't want to be upstaged. They didn't know what their own script was. And if you look at the script, both Rubio and Waltz repeatedly referred to Trump being the greatest negotiator in the world, the only negotiator capable of solving this problem, etc., etc., etc. You ask a good question. Why? What role can General Kellogg play now? The answer is that I think the formula that each side agreed with the other, announced by Rubio, announced by Lavrov, that a negotiating team will be decided in 2 weeks, means, to use Trump's famous word, Kellogg has been fired. Kellogg has a deputy, a Trump lawyer named, I think his first name's John Cole, Coale. He's a lawyer. The deputy wasn't there either, so far as we can tell. And Cole may retain a role. But these are middle-level people. They aren't operational as intelligence officers. They're not analysts. They're not military tacticians who understand the battlefield and what the terms of disengagement might be and so forth and so on. But to say that the sides have agreed to continue talking and that a negotiating team will be decided in 2 weeks means, I think, Kellogg is fired.
If we assume that Donald Trump and his administration wants to get from point A to point B. Point E would be their objective, whatever would that be. And we know that at least so far, it doesn't seem that they're totally prepared to negotiate, to get along, negotiate with Russia to get to the point B. But Putin just disconsidering the way that they can get to point B. How do you picture the point B for Donald Trump, the main objective for Donald Trump with Russia?
You
What
can't
do they want to get with Russia?
Ah, I mean, look, speaking as an American who's been a foreign correspondent in Russia for 30 years, uh, I would have to say that uh, I, I can't answer what Trump's end goal would be beyond what he says. And what he says is, I'm the greatest negotiator in the world. I'm the only one who could have ended this war. If I'd been there, this war wouldn't have happened. Well, we know that this is more than hyperbole. The greatest of American hyperbolists was Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer of all time. I believe that. I've watched his fights many times over, and I knew the man very briefly for a little while. He was a wonderful man, and his hyperbole was always, always implemented in the ring. And he died from it, from the punishment that he took to his head. But the greatest boxer of all time was Muhammad Ali. This hyperbole that Trump comes up with is never tested in the ring. It's never been tested in business. The business test is balance sheet. It's debt versus earnings, that ratio. There are a bunch of accounting tests of how clever, how brilliant President Trump is at his own business, at his family business, in politics. He has won twice, and let's give him credit for winning. Let's see whether he can articulate for his domestic constituencies a more reliable set of outcomes than he seems to be able to deliver so far on the foreign policy front, on the battlefield front. So I'm walking away from your question, Neem. It's a fair question, but I can't answer what he thinks is the outcome, except that the outcome should magnify his role. That's the only consistent line I can see. Therefore, his instructions to Rubio and Waltz was, go there and set up the summit meeting for me with Putin. That's what I want. And I will knock heads together. I will prove that I'm the greatest. Muhammad Ali was the greatest. Trump is empty. He won't even get that summit meeting by agreement between his men, Rubio and Waltz, on the one hand, and Lavrov and Ushakov on the other. The agreement was no summit meeting until the agendas are worked out, the points of agreement and disagreement are negotiated over how many months now, how many weeks now. What Trump wanted was immediate gratification and immediate PR triumph. He won't get it. So what else does he want? Answer, if the Russians test him, the best way to test Trump, if we've understood his motives correctly, is to delay, talk and analyze and do it on paper, stuff that Trump can't tolerate. And if he can't tolerate it, what sort of explosion will he demonstrate? What sort of anger? Against whom will he display impatience, anger? That would be a an appropriate Russian strategy. But here I am with you discussing this, and it would be impolite in Moscow if I were an official to say that's what I'm doing. But protraction as a strategy, as a tactic to drive President Trump mad, that's good politics in this situation. And that's my answer to your question. The Russian side will test him by this method.
Here is Joseph Borrell, the former EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs. He said that there is an uncoordinated divorce taking place in the relationship between the US and European Union or European countries. How what was the effect, what was the influence of this meeting between the two delegations, the Russian and the US delegation, on Europe? Macron, he had an urgent summit with some countries, some European
Mhm.
countries. He now he's talking again about having a bunch of other European countries. I don't know why he didn't invite all of them together. And that's a huge question. But how is that going to be perceived by Europeans? What has happened in Saudi Arabia?
Well, um, we did touch on this in our last meeting. Um,
Which was before the meeting.
True, but the point I think I'd return to as an answer is each of these individuals are politicians facing a hostile electorate, with polls dropping like stones, especially in France with Macron. So each of these individuals, Starmer in the UK will go to Washington next week. Macron will, one way or another, try to arrange a meeting with Trump if Trump agrees. Meloni of Italy, the same, and so forth. What Trump will think of doing is play one off against another to maximize the amount of kasha he sees in Europe, among the Western European allies, for his idea of Europe must pay more to the United States for arms, exactly the way Poland has agreed to do. All of the Polish increase in GDP for defense goes back to the United States to produce tanks, which the Russians have blown out of the ground on the battlefield, and aircraft, which will equally be vulnerable, and anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems, all of which have been defeated on the battlefield. But Poland's paying the US, and that's clearly a Trump objective. And you can translate that into constituencies, political geography, and votes. The Europeans are the same. Germany's the most important of the countries, and you didn't mention it because we don't know what sort of Christian Democratic Union alliance with AfD will emerge after the election, because we don't know what the balance of votes will be in that
Yeah.
country.
In 4 years,
But
we're gonna have the result in 4 days. Yeah.
well, we might have an unstable negotiation of power share, of political power sharing, as there was after the Schultz election. But your question was, what can the Europeans do to, as it were, mollify Trump and maximize their benefit for their own domestic election purposes? Because it's very difficult, if not impossible, for weak politicians whose polls are falling to get their voters to subscribe more and more of their tax for defense when they can't go to the hospital, when the ambulance doesn't show up, when their children can't go to school, or when their schools are deteriorating, and so forth and so on. The standard domestic welfare is killing these weak politicians. So what Trump is doing is threatening their own domestic political future and survival. How do they solve that problem? The British believe they have a special relationship. What the British contribute is deception operations. I've just produced a book called Long Live Novichok, which illustrates the way in which the British pulled off a fabrication, a fake, that the entire world believes. But interestingly enough, Rubio in his remarks hinted that when Starmer comes to Washington next week, maybe the US attitude to Novichok as the beginning of the process by which diplomatic relations with Russia were broken from 2018. All of that's in Long Live Novichok. If the US wants to repair its diplomatic relations, Matt Lee of AP asked Rubio, what happens to the Skripal case? Is that closed? What happens to the annexation of Crimea? Is that closed? And Rubio couldn't really answer. He stumbled as badly as Trump did. If that's an example of the answer to your question, how can they respond to the British? The same situation applies in Italy, it applies in France, it applies in Spain, it applies in Portugal, it applies in Greece. But I think we can take for granted the US has no interest, will make no decision to relieve the Europeans of US occupation of Europe as part of the US empire it acquired after World War II. When Trump said in the unquoted part of his press conference a Mar-a-Lago that he does not wish to have US troops come home from Europe, which means Germany, Finland, Poland, and so on, he's saying he's perfectly comfortable with US military occupation in Europe, which means that he's perfectly comfortable and will resist, in fact, any change in this traditional relationship of master and servant, European inferiority in the US empire. What we said before, and I believe the Europeans see it too, is that they can't persuade their voters to pay more for defense against the Russian enemy and the Chinese enemy. And they haven't switched, as Trump has, from the Russian enemy to the Chinese enemy as a priority of war making. That's what we discussed before as the Trump priority. One war, 1.5 wars at a time. Let's reduce the cost to us of the Ukraine war and recruit the white Russians in a race war against the yellow Chinese. That's the level of the Confederate level, the people I've referred to as Confederates, Rubio, Waltz, and Ratcliffe too, at the top of Trump's administration, who have a history of race hatred, particularly towards the Chinese, and think that white folks can be mobilized like the Russians. That's what they think. Underneath them, underneath the Confederates, there's the Trump family and the Witkoff business constituencies, with whom Kirill Dmitriev is having a negotiation to produce business as usual. Can you have an empire maintain business as usual while shifting to a race war against China, given China's economic dominance in the world? I don't think so, but I'm not an expert at that. And you have some very good experts on your program who can explain why that's impossible.
Before wrapping up, John, before wrapping up this session, here is what Starmer is talking about. I want to know what's your take on what the British government is talking about.
Will have to do more. The issue of burden sharing is not new, but it is now pressing. And Europeans will have to step up, both in terms of spending and the capabilities that we provide. On Ukraine, we're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. So I will go to Washington next week to meet President Trump.
Is it acceptable for Russia, the way that he's talking about
Absolutely
the
not.
aftermath of any sort of peace solution, any sort of peace talk?
Mr. Lavrov was very clear about that in his press conference. He was asked a question about troops on the ground, and he referred to the various publicity plans that have emerged, indicating European, including British forces in the Ukraine. And Mr. Lavrov said that is unacceptable to us. So it's a non-starter. And you heard Prime Minister Starmer using the word if, and if is conditional, which is rejected by the Russian side. There might be, in a zone of disengagement, as the Europeans want to call it, or a demilitarized zone in the Ukraine, there might be a peacekeeping force. There might be, but it will not be under any form representing any one of the enemy states who fought in the Ukraine. The British continue to fly hostile missions over the Black Sea to direct Ukrainian missile and drone attacks on the Russian hinterland. They're not stopping that. They have no boots to put on the ground. They barely have a navy. As Bismarck once said, if the British army were to come to the German border, I'd send the gendarmerie to arrest them. That was a famous 19th century joke of British military capability. British capability now in the special relationship isn't military. It's intelligence and deception. It's disinformation. It's propaganda. That's what the book Long Live Novichok is about. The Prime Minister of England used to be a prosecutor, a lawyer, and in charge of the legal process in Britain. Long Live Novichok's a history of a very successful deception operation about a fake poison that was used by the British and President Trump. President Trump was in charge in 2018 when the British launched the Novichok operation, which successfully broke diplomatic relationships with Russia all around the world, which broke the OPCW, the Organization Protection from Chemical Weapons, Prevention of Chemical Weapons. I always get OPCW wrong. That organization will never, ever function as it was designed to be again. And it has broken most of the international organizations including the British judiciary, has broken over this fake and this fabrication. I think that Starmer can come to the table in Washington next week, but he has very little room to negotiate because he has no money. He has British capabilities without money, without boots. And this is the same for all of them, all of the Europeans we're talking about.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you very much for having me, Nima.
Thank you. Take care, John. See you soon.